Hello there, Drew Handish of Whiskey Lore. Time for another whiskey tasting. Time to bust some myths, which I love to do. Whiskey Lore, always talking myths and trying to break down and get you the truth. So there is John E. Fitzgerald's Larceny. Now, if you ever go to the Heaven Hill Distillery and you take the tour and they do a tasting of Larceny, they're going to tell you the story about a treasury agent during Prohibition who really, he had to set, there's a picture of a key there, and the idea is that the man held the keys, and so he would go up and he would sneak bourbon all the time, and he had a particular part of the warehouse that he enjoyed, and he would go there and he'd fill a jug and he'd take some of his whiskey home, and then they found out that the barrels were a little light, and those were such good whiskeys that they started calling them the Fitzgerald barrels, and the rest is history. True? No. I don't think so. Maybe this story came about from the Van Winkles because the Fitzgerald name ended up with, Old Fitzgerald ended up with the Stitzel Weller distillery, and then eventually over to Heaven Hill not too long ago. And so the story is kind of followed along. What's the true story behind John E. Fitzgerald? Well, first of all, let's maybe look into this idea of the idea that this guy was a treasury agent. Now, there's a date on this bottle, and it's 1870. Now, if John E. Fitzgerald were making whiskey in 1870, then he would be how old by the time Prohibition came about? I mean, 20 in 18, let's say he was 20 in 1870, and then, we're into he's going to be at least 70 by the beginning of Prohibition. So, sounds like he may be a little long in the tooth to be a federal agent. So, the idea now is that, well, maybe he's not the same guy that maybe we were thinking about that established a distillery with his bare hands in 1870, and so they've kind of dismissed that part and said, well, he must be the treasury agent. Well, here's the thing. There was a John E. Fitzgerald who was an Irish distiller, and he actually owned a distillery in Frankfurt. And that distillery he ended up selling to, oh my goodness, I can't remember the guy's name, Solomon Herbst, who was a transplant from Milwaukee. And he came down and he bought the distillery, and as the story goes, he created Old Judge whiskey. And he created Old Judge whiskey from John E. Fitzgerald's recipe. Now, I don't know where John E. Fitzgerald started in terms of distillation. And what's interesting is the only stories I could find on John E. Fitzgerald is that he was from Chicago, and in 1901, he ended up buying into the Hammond, Indiana distillery, and when he did, he had apparently had some experience in working with the Whiskey Trust from Peoria, Illinois, who we talked about not too long ago, and so this John E. Fitzgerald actually started, or was the secretary and treasurer of the Hammond distillery in Hammond, Illinois, or Indiana, I'm sorry, and so there was a guy named John E. Fitzgerald, but he's listed as being from Chicago. Now, the myth goes that this John E. Fitzgerald that owned the pre-Old Judge distillery went off to Hammond, Indiana. If that's true, and it could be, it would make sense that he would become the secretary of this larger firm. And that maybe his experience with the Whiskey Trust came when the Whiskey Trust was buying finally into Kentucky distilleries around 1899. But that would have been a very short period of time that he would have had experience. Well, as I was digging in, I'm having to lean on my notes a little bit on this one. There was a John E. Fitzgerald distillery, and that was in Frankfurt. And as late as 1906, there is mention in the news about John E. Fitzgerald, the distillery, that had a big accident and a bunch of their whiskey ended up washing into Benson Creek. And so, and they were known for making handmade pot still whiskey the old-fashioned way. Now, if you ever see Henry McKenna on your shelf, and you think that is anything close to what Henry McKenna used to be, Henry McKenna used to be made in pot stills. So now it's made in column stills and also made by Heaven Hill, another one of those whiskeys that has kind of, the myths carry on as we roll along with these guys. But anyway, so the best I could find in terms of a Fitzgerald as a treasury agent was a treasury agent out of Cincinnati named Ed Fitzgerald. Now, John E. Fitzgerald, maybe he was just going by Ed and ignoring his first name. People do that. And maybe this was a different John E. Fitzgerald. But there was a John E. Fitzgerald distillery in Frankfurt. I would assume that that's where old Fitzgerald came from. So I got to do more research. I got to dig a little bit deeper into this. But I thought it'd be kind of fun to look at this from a high level and kind of get a sense, because we're given so many myths about this. And what's interesting is the myth that they discounted about John E. Fitzgerald being an Irish distiller. There was an Irish distiller named John E. Fitzgerald, and he did, as far as I can tell, maybe not, because what I read said he was from Chicago, have some dealings potentially with the Whiskey Trust and Kentucky Distilling. So this is the challenge. It really is the challenge. First of all, getting past the myths, but also digging through all of these archives. And when you get a name like John E. Fitzgerald, you're talking about a name that was fairly popular back then. And so there could be multiple ones. Whereas, we don't know with this Herbst fellow, Solomon Herbst. I'm sure there weren't a lot of Solomon Herbst floating around. And so I'm pretty sure that this guy is who he says he is. But anyway, all right, let's jump in and do a nosing and tasting on this. Now, this is a wheated bourbon. So we're looking at a mash bill here that's going to be 68% corn, 12% wheat, 20% wheat, and 12% malted barley. So it's a high wheat bourbon mash bill, but it's not excessively high wheat. Well, we're saying that 32% of it is not corn, but it's still got a decent amount of corn in this whiskey. 46% ABV. There's some top level spices, baking spices coming out of this, but very, very light. A little toasted caramel. Something that reminds me of like Elmer's glue. That's interesting. Not that I was sniffing glue a lot when I was younger. Don't start any rumors. Cheers. Nice bit of toffee on the palate. Go somewhere. Go somewhere. Go somewhere. Nope. Not going anywhere. Toasted toffee continues, but it kind of washes out. It's left a little bit on the palate. Maybe some wood spice in there. Not a lot. It's interesting. It's one of those whiskeys that when I look at their marketing, it looks like they're trying to sell it to people who want a whiskey that's not going to challenge them. And I would say that this is exactly the perfect way to describe this whiskey. It's not a whiskey that's going to challenge you in any way, shape, or form. It is pretty straightforward, easy drinking, and man, I miss the rye. I really have become attached to rye whiskeys or bourbons that have a nice rye content to them, because at least it brings some extra interest to the whiskey. You know, when you talk about like a Maker's Mark 46, I like Maker's Mark 46. I think those French staves give it a little additional personality that a wheated bourbon needs. I still believe, and nobody's proven me wrong on this so far, that wheated whiskeys require a decent amount of age to become interesting. And I don't know what the age is on this, but I will say it is not enough, because it's not bringing me much in the way of interest. It is just something to drink, and that's about it for me. Now, there are barrel proof versions of this, just like with the Elijah Craig, and people glow about these things. I haven't had one yet. It would be interesting to try one, but honestly, I don't know how just a stronger version of this is going to impress me anymore unless it's been aged a little bit longer or something like that. Now, Old Fitz I like. I like some wheated bourbons. Weller. I've enjoyed Weller. The Antique 107 is excellent. The 12-year, I've heard it's got good years and bad years. I've found that when I've had it, it was actually really good. But then again, that's long aged in a barrel. And Weller Antique 107, that's going to be a higher proof whiskey. So maybe the higher proof would make a difference. But for me, honestly, I could take or leave this stuff. It's not expensive. I guess it's worth a flyer if you want to have, something inexpensive. But I'm just really glad I bought a mini bottle of it, because I likely won't ever look at it again on the shelf. It's just there. And I would like to have something that at least gives me a little bit of a challenge. So if you're looking for something mild and easy to drink, Larceny may be for you. For me, just a little bit too mild for me. What do you guys think? You enjoy Larceny? What do you think of the barrel proof? Have you had it? Is it something I should try? Or do you feel like I'm just getting a slightly stronger version of what I'm already tasting in this, and that's not going to necessarily take me where I want to go? Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Give me your comments below. Like if you enjoyed it. And, I'll tell more about this myth or the story of Johnny Fitzgerald as I start to really dig in a little bit deeper. Surface level stuff today, but definitely something I want to jump into in the future, because it sounds like it ties into the Whiskey Trust and ties into Frankfurt Distilling as well, which would be really interesting to see whether these names and things all come together. Until next time, cheers and Slainte. All right, I guess. Yeah.